Welcome to Wealthing Talks. I am your host, Alicia Castillo Holley, bringing you real-life conversations from Silicon Valley or somewhere around the world. We will talk about disruptors, angel investments, venture capital, and of course, family offices. Join me along with my children, their families, friends, disruptors, and investors as we explore the fascinating world of creating wealth in a completely different and authentic way. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here in this new episode of the Wealthing Podcast. It is an absolute pleasure to introduce you to Lise. Lise, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be having this podcast with you, Alicia.
So let's just start with what are you doing now and how did you get here? Because your path is absolutely fascinating.
Yes, well, thanks for that. I guess what I'm doing now, I'm the co-founder and managing partner at a fund called BKR Capital. We're based out of Toronto. And what we're doing now, for me, the way I would describe it in a few words is that we're changing narratives. I've been in the investment world for a long time. I started my career in hedge funds. Then I transitioned into impact investing. I did, funds of funds investment, direct investment. But throughout, this whole history, we were discussing that. I traveled the world and basically got to meet a lot of people from different backgrounds, different cultures, and just really got to embrace, rubbing shoulders with builders, with people who were not seeing problems, they were seeing challenges to be solved and fixed. And I love that. And I really feel like we all have an agency where we can change the world in our own way. And I wanted to be part of that. What I've seen as well that touched me was the gap I was seeing in terms of financing with respect to the Black community. So that was very present where I grew up in Canada, but also throughout the world, and even where I worked in Africa. I think it made the news at some point, but in 2018 there was a big uprising in Kenya where founders were really unhappy because to be funded, you absolutely had to have a foreign co-founder. And there was this real gap even on the African continent. And to me, it just felt like such a missed opportunity from the financial ecosystem, because you see so many builders and people who are so smart, who are working on incredible projects, who are just being ignored because of bias. So I thought that I wanted to be part of the solution. Again, with that same mindset, it's just a challenge, and we decided to create we started working on it in 2020. I think that COVID, as hard as it was for everyone, was also a period where a lot of great ideas were born because of that time where people were able to sort of sit down and work on other things. So we started working, me and my co-founder, on this idea of this venture capital fund, and we launched in 2021. We became the first Black-led VC fund in Canada. And we went in the market to raise $10 million. We oversubscribed at 22. And we since then we've invested in 15 trailblazers who are changing the narrative in Canada. We just announced this week the first close of our second fund, where we're looking at doing more. So we're looking at doubling down on innovators from diverse communities and making sure that we're contributing in our own way to seeing new innovations, coming to this world.
So this is interesting. Most people, including myself, don't know some of the key challenges that Black founders face. I can talk about Latinas, I can talk about women, but we tend to think that if you're talented, if you're good at something, you will get funded. But in our conversation last week or 2 weeks ago in Montreal, you told me something that I wasn't aware, and I want to use the podcast to amplify the opportunities there are and to raise awareness of some of the challenges. When you mentioned that there was I wouldn't call it an uproar, but there was a recognition in Kenya that, wait a second, we don't need a white co-founder or founder to raise money. Tell us a little bit more about what you saw and how do you see the opportunities?
So I think what's the challenge with venture capital itself is that when you invest early in a founder, you invest in the team more than in the idea, right?
Hmm.
So there's a lot of intangibles. Do you
Hmm.
believe that the person that you have in front of you will be that winner, right? Regardless of how good the idea is. And often we will benchmark this against what we've seen, what we understand what is around us. The issue probably that we're seeing mainly on the African continent is because a lot of the funding coming to invest in startups comes from outside.
I
So
see.
decision makers are often people who also come from outside. And so that bias often is there. Not always, but often is there, especially if there's not a lot of diversity at the table when the decision is
Mhm.
being made. Um, and I'm seeing it as well, when we are looking at deals, it's actually, I think it's refreshing for founders sometimes to not necessarily have to over explain a problem, because somebody's going to talk to me about an opportunity in the black hair market, and I know and I understand,
Yeah.
so they don't have to spend that much time on it, right? Or just the way of presenting themselves, feeling like, is it okay, like, do I look professional if I'm wearing braids? Like, of course you look like I'm wearing braids, like, of course this is professional, right? Or it's it's a lot of those small nuanced things, because it's an industry that basically relies on trust quite a bit.
Hmm.
And to trust, you have to feel comfortable with money, right? And that's where often there's this gap that exists in our ecosystem. So we feel would be the solution is really to have more diverse tables, because we also have biased interests. If I feel like funds that are focused on women often will have maybe more female on their team, and will probably have a certain way of investing or looking at problems, which is, I think, often very optimal. But you also need to have that other perspective too. So basically, allowing men to enter the room and also providing insight. Same thing from a racial perspective, and like the different types of backgrounds too. So the more diversity you have around the table, the more optimal your decision making will be. And that's what we're trying to bring to the Canadian ecosystem. We've not only built our fund and being able to invest in incredible builders, we brought other funds with us, from, I guess, the more quote unquote mainstream investment space, because we have more of an inclusive lens, and they were able to see and appreciate the opportunities that we're bringing to them. So we've been really, really good at finding co-investors. We have our nonprofit, the BKR Catalyst Institute, that provides training to Black professionals who are interested in entering the venture capital space. Again, we're doing that because we just want to see, more like diversity of thoughts around the table, and creating a change that outlives us. If at the end, in at the end of our journey, whenever that might be, there's not much change, or everything was carried through us, then I think we would have failed. The whole goal is to make sure that we're adding value to the ecosystem in a way that whatever we're building stays even after we're long gone.
Yeah, yeah, no, that was part of the conversation that we have. But it's really interesting to see some of the challenges that we don't know that exist. So that's part of the bias. And
Mhm.
sometimes I am aware that when I move countries, people look through me as if I didn't exist. And that was part of the bias that they have. And even today, as an investor, as a female investor, as a more senior woman investor, a lot of people come and tell me, how do I need to manage my money? Or they come and say, well, I'll give you the confidence. And I'm like, I don't need that. I'm confident enough and I don't need it. Yeah. So it's really interesting that people don't are not aware of that. And I want to take this opportunity to raise awareness of that. And I really like what you're doing, building those bridges. Tell me, if you were to write a letter to yourself, to your younger self, what are the things that you've learned in the last 20 years that you didn't know? And what would that letter be to yourself saying, hey, make sure that you do this, or remember this is something that you would encounter that you didn't know?
That's
What
a
are the
very good
limits?
question. I
Mhm.
always struggle with this question. But it's a very good one. And I think that's something that I'm still working through, to be honest. And I would, try to tell my younger self. Um, to me, credibility is something that's very, very important. And that means that, I'm so hard on myself with, trying to be able to do everything. You want to do it all, you want to be it all. Um, but you don't need to do it all, and you don't need to be it all to be able to be successful, to be able to move forward. And basically, um, removing that layer of stress, I think would have been beneficial for me. As I moved along, not necessarily in trying to learn less or do less, because I am curious and I love to explore things, but maybe in removing that feeling that I am not enough. Because I had that, and I sometimes I'm still carrying it. In feeling like, wow, I should be able to do this better, to do this faster, and just really making sure I'm just well surrounded. It takes a village to be able to build great things, and it's okay. It's okay to rest. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. So yeah, that's what I would tell my younger self, I think.
Yeah, that I can relate to that. But I also think that if we had not had that drive, probably we wouldn't be here. So
That's true.
it probably takes that. But that's I've also learned that there's other learnings that I have because I'm much older than you. But that'll come later. That will come later. Now I want to shift the question to a question that is really the essence of my work, and it's about socioeconomic progress. And this question is very intentional about creating wealth. I want to know, what is your opinion about wealth? What is your concept of wealth? And how do you think we can create wealth, or we create wealth? And then I'm going to shift that after that to what you're doing at the moment. So, what is wealth? How do you think we create wealth? And then how are you part of that socioeconomic progress?
Me, wealth is about having a choice, right? It's optionality.
Mm-hmm.
So being well enough so that you can actually um, that you're not on survival mode, right? That you can shift decisions, that you can build, that you can invest in people, that you can invest in projects. For me, that's what is true wealth. I think at the moment, if you always feel insecure, and you feel frail, that's when you basically probably have not achieved that level of stability that you need. So for me, that's what wealth means, is having optionality, having freedom. um and sorry, what was the other question? You mentioned what it is to me,
Well,
and then
how do you create that? How do you create wealth, and how does BKR is being part of the solution?
absolutely. So you create wealth through ownership, ultimately. I
Hmm.
think it's being ownership of assets, ownerships of yeah, ownership of basically being able to plan. So if you want to basically go read textbook about wealth, so ownership of assets that is widely diversified, and making sure you might have a bit of passive income, that that the amount that you're making is not necessarily linked to the efforts that you're doing on a regular basis. That creates a bit of freedom to start with. But I think wealth also comes from your surroundings, your connections, your ability to grow, and your ability to shift things, to influence power as well. And I think that the way we are contributing on both front at BKR is through investing in companies that we believe will be the next big champions in our ecosystem, that are shifting our future. And that's very important to me, because we need to be able to have innovation that reflects all of us, and that is helpful for all of us. So that on one end, and through this contribution to innovation, to technology, then you also have the power to influence ideas, where priorities are being placed, and we're contributing to making sure that there's a portion of the population that is not left behind, basically, not in all of those conversations.
What I know. as a VC, it's hard to have favorites because this is like all the portfolio companies are your kids. Do you have a couple that you say, hey, for example, we invest in this company and this company is doing that, or what is your profile of companies that you invest in?
So we're sector agnostic and we invest pretty early stage. And we invest mainly in Canada, but we have a few, US based companies. Our companies, despite all being based in North America, have an incredible international reach. So we have lots of exposure on the African continent and in the Caribbean specifically. Again, I don't have any favorites,
Oh,
but
but
our,
but this is like a mom. I don't have any favorite, but I remember one time. You can just pick one. I mean, I don't. We don't want the other ones to be left out, but it's just fun to
no,
have just a case.
no, for sure, for sure. It's also like what they're building. So we have one company that is basically supporting the elderly population and basically like empowering people with early dementia, right?
Uh-huh.
So, um, you know, I think there's nothing more scary than sensing that you are you're losing that power, that basically your brain is leaving you.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's something that happens more and more. And so the company is called Moneta Health. And basically their platform is a bit, they describe it as being the physiotherapy for the brain. So it's exercises that are tailored for the individuals that really allow them to just get control back. And it's science. It's proven scientifically that it works, and we've seen so many testimonials, and that definitely warms my heart because you see the testimonials is basically those were like sales professionals or like high flying CEOs or regardless of what their
Yeah.
past lives were before they retired, but people who just love life so much, then they're sensing that something is basically leaving them, and they're trying to just get a better grasp. There was a particular story that I really liked was this couple that for 30 years the man was basically waking up and making coffee for both of them. And then from one day to another, he was no longer able to make coffee. He did not know how to make coffee anymore. And
Wow.
after going through that process with Moneta Health, he was able to make coffee again. Just that it seems small, but it's life changing in somebody's life. And yeah, and I think and it's both powerful and even from a business opportunity is a good one because unfortunately, cognitive decline and dementia it's growing, unfortunately, but it's nice to feel like you're part of the solution again to a very important problem.
I love it. I love it. I was at I was leading a panel on energy investing, and I stopped for a second and I said, I also invest in the things that'll make you live longer, better. And we can have all the money in the world, but at the end, the quality of life is something that we cannot give up, and if we lose it, it's so important. And what you just described is a typical example of investing well. So you do get a return on investment, but you do it with immense joy of contributing to betterment of society. So thank you for sharing that with us. We'll put it in the credits too, so people can go and check it out. Yeah, this is
Sounds good.
really, really important. This is really, really important. Let me go now to the final questions of this podcast, which is a more spiritual question. I don't know if you know that when I was 13, I was in a coma and I died, but I didn't die completely. So they returned me from whatever. I wish to say from heaven, but I was too young to be there. Um, but something happens when you see that you're dead, and then you wake up and you're like, oh no, no, I'm back, and it shaped my life. And I always think about what is my essence, who am I when I'm no longer here. So that is a final question that I always pose to my guests. Have you thought about what are you leaving behind? What is your legacy? Who is Liz when Liz is no longer here? Who is Liz also for our listeners that might not have the opportunity to meet you, but you can have this um, legacy towards so many people around the world through the work that you do. So have you thought about what is your essence?
It's such a deep question, and thank you for sharing your own experience. Um, I think my essence is, I care a lot about people. I really do care,
Mhm.
and I hope, if, when I leave that people remember that, that it's not just about, business, finance, investment, but it's about, caring. And I hope that through that care, I would have enabled so many people, make that like being that shift in somebody's life, being that early believer from an investment perspective, not just from a monetary standpoint, but just, having been there in tough moments, when it mattered to basically give that energy to people or even if it's not necessarily intentional by what we've created having inspired others to sort of feel like they can also create change. It doesn't need to be in our industry, but feeling like it's possible for me too. And ultimately what I really want is to create a better world for my boys to grow in. I want them to have another perspective of life, and if I can have help through that, I it's not even about like myself, but really how do I shift the world. But yeah, if my true essence, I think I want people to remember that I care, that I really care about them, and I hope that this will have also impacted their trajectory.
Great. And it's possible to care and to be a good investor.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that's what we are. And I think it's even more it's not that it's more challenging, but it requires additional types of skills, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
To sort of say, you know what, no, but this is how I'm going to help you instead. Or this is basically the feedback that I think will get you in the right direction. Or um, I think that's the greatest form of caring, to actually be strict on principles, because you actually want people to be successful. It's not just about, you want people to be successful. You also have your responsibility towards your LPs. You want them to be successful through that strategy as well. Um, so yeah, I think caring and being a good investor really goes hand in hand.
I love what you said that because I used to tell, no, I used to tell that to my kids, but I took it to all my relationships. And I tell some founders when I have to tell them something that they might not want to hear. I always start with the caring part. I said, I'm going to tell you something because I care for you and I'm risking your perception of me or my relationship. So it comes from a lot of respect, but this is going against you or this is not the right business model and this is why we're not investing. And I think that's part of caring. And I think
Yeah.
people really care that shows up. So I really like the way you said that. And of course, that's probably why we get along so well. Liz, how do people get in touch with you? And tell us a little bit more about the second fund that you're raising.
Absolutely. So people can get in touch with me through LinkedIn. I'm very responsive. And the second fund that we're raising is a $50 million Canadian fund. The difference between the first fund and the second one is that this time we have a little bit more international budget. So it's going to be 80% companies registered in Canada and 20% outside. We also are doing pre-seed, seed, and Series A. Fund one was just pre-seed and seed, but we're still doubling down on underrepresentation. So for us, it's really important to fill that gap that exists because it unfortunately hasn't been solved in the past years. So we're doubling down. There's still a lot of Black innovators out there who are building and solving issues that will help, the whole ecosystem. So we're excited. It's a tough fundraising environment, but we have returning institutions that came back because they saw the strong performance of Fund One, where we're top quartile, for vintages our year, if based on a Cartas number. And we're excited. We see so many amazing innovators. And yeah, and we think that the work is just getting started. So as you can tell, I'm really excited about the work that we're doing.
Yeah, yeah. No, there's so many opportunities for people that are invisible to the majority of VCs. So I fully subscribe with that. Liz, thank you so much for sharing your experience, for spending time with us. I really appreciate having you as a guest.
Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I met Liz a few years ago, but we touched bases in Montreal a couple of weeks ago. And I was blown away by her experience in Africa and building bridges between Canada and Africa. Her views are extremely international, and what she's doing with her fund is really interesting. Not only because their approach to businesses from her community is different, but because they have a global perspective from the get-go. And this is something immigrants do all the time and gets completely under-recognized by the typical VC community. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next podcast. This is Alicia Castillo Holley, your host. Thanks for tuning in to our Wealthing Talks. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. To stay connected, visit us at wealthing.com. This is Alicia Castillo Holley, your host, and until next time, yours in Wealthing.